Research shows that getting poor sleep on a regular basis increases your risk of obesity and decreases the likelihood that you can lose weight and keep it off long term. Not only that, but impaired sleep on a consistent basis can decrease your body composition results, it can decrease your performance, and decrease your general health. So there's a lot of really good reasons for why you'd want to prioritize your sleep, especially if you want to improve your body composition. Now, in a later module, we're actually going to do a very deep dive on sleep and how to actually address that whole situation. Today, we're going to be doing more of an introductory video because sleep absolutely affects your behavior, and we're going to go into that, but we're going to keep things a little bit more superficial so you can understand the general framework of how this is affecting your behavior and the decisions that you make around your eating. We're also going to be giving you some very specific takeaways that you can implement in your own routine today to start seeing better results, get better sleep, and therefore improve your body composition and your performance. So let's dive right in. First off, we need to discuss what sleep restriction is and what sleep requirements actually are. So an individual's sleep requirements are going to be variable depending on a variety of different contexts. So for instance, what is the age of the individual? What is their current health status? What is their activity level? What is their disease state? Do they have a very significant disease? Are they injured? So there's a variety of different variables that can impact your sleep requirements. Now, generally speaking, for the context and for the purpose of these videos, I would suspect that anything less than 7 hours, probably you're risking insufficiency with regards to your sleep. Now, the reason why I would say 7 hours is probably my minimum cutoff is because most of the people watching this are not just sedentary individuals. Most of the people watching this are resistance training on a regular basis, or you're doing some sort of cardiovascular conditioning, or a combination of the two. You guys have some sort of athletic goals and or body composition related goals, which increases the physical demand on your body. Therefore, you're going to require greater recovery resources. So if we're not sleeping sufficiently to fuel just regular day-to-day activities, it's going to be very hard to recover and actually add on a bunch of additional physiological and psychological stress that's going to come from training and from the burden of just dieting and doing all those additional things in general. Now, from a performance standpoint, my general recommendation is 7 to 9 hours of sleep at night, every night. If you can do that, you're probably doing a pretty good job of checking off all the boxes from like the sleep and recovery standpoint, okay? Now, again, there is variability. I have had clients who have slept, let's say 6 or 6.5 hours every night, which again would put them in that sort of precarious threshold, but their sleep quality is really high. So let's say on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being terrible, 5 being excellent, their sleep is consistently a 4 or 5. So even though the total duration is not great, the quality is really good. Now, conversely, I've also had clients who have come to me, and when we start working together, they're getting 10 to 12 hours of sleep a night consistently, and yet their sleep quality is like a 1 or a 2 out of 5. So it's not just a matter of the total duration of sleep that you're getting, it's also a factor. We also have to factor in the quality of the sleep. And so ideally, you want to have high quality sleep and total duration of sleep that is sufficient and falls within that 7 to 9 hour range, especially if you're athletically inclined. Now, there is one other thing to note, and we're going to do a much deeper dive in the later module, but one other thing that's important to understand is that the time that you go to bed and wake up makes a big difference. So if we have two identical clones, okay, one individual goes to bed at 10 p.m. and they wake up at 6 a.m., okay? They're going to bed and waking up at a time that fits with their natural biological circadian rhythm. So your circadian rhythm is this sort of internal clock that's based on the light exposure and a whole host of other things, but basically how we interact with our environment. And so if we start going to bed, let's say at 2 a.m. and waking up at 10 a.m., or if we go to bed at 6 a.m. and we get up at 2 or something like that, even if we're getting the same amount of sleep, because we're awake through the night and we're sleeping through the day, that can mess up your natural biological rhythm. And that has very significant impacts on mortality rates, on disease states, on injury risk and recovery, and just kind of general energy and how you feel. So if you work shift work, if you work the graveyard shift or anything like that, that can absolutely impair your sleep, irrespective of whether or not you're getting that 7 to 9 hours every night. So that can be a very big barrier as well. And generally speaking, you're not going to get as good quality of sleep if you're sleeping through the day and you're awake and working or doing something during the night. So just as a kind of a general rule, I think these are some fairly good guidelines to get you in the ballpark. Aim for 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Generally, you want to be sleeping at consistent times. You want to make sure that you're not necessarily awake during the night and then sleeping during the day. And again, we'll go over some more of the particulars a little bit later on in this video. Now, the CDC, or the Center of Disease, estimates that 22 to 44% of Americans are sleep restricted. Now, I would actually suspect that it's probably a larger percentage of the population that is sleep restricted. But again, this goes back to the actual operational definition of what sleep restriction actually is. Now, a lot of the times we classify it as like 6 or 5 hours of sleep and things like that. But again, that definition is going to change. But still, 22 to 44% is a very, very large percentage. And so the probability that the individuals watching this, that some of you guys are sleep restricted, is fairly high. Now, according to the NIH, or the National Institute of Health, nearly 40% of adults report falling asleep during the day without meaning to at least once a month. Now, additionally, it's estimated that 50 to 70 million of Americans have chronic or ongoing sleep disorders. So sleep restriction is not just something that, a very select few experience. It's very, very common. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the probability that the individuals watching this have some sort of sleep issue, or maybe the quality of sleep that you're getting isn't great, maybe you're waking up frequently throughout the middle of the night, or any host of other issues, this video is going to help you correct a lot of those things. So we can look at several of the primary reasons why sleep restriction is going to negatively affect your body composition, your performance, and so on. One is sleep restriction increases your food reward valuation and pursuit. Okay, so a 2000 paper by Malik et al. Found that ghrelin impacts the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex, enhancing the hedonic and incentive response to food-related cues. Okay, it's a bit of a word salad for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with the research, but essentially what this is saying is that ghrelin is kind of what's known as a hunger hormone. So when ghrelin is elevated, we see an increase in appetite, we see an increase in hunger, and a drive to pursue consumption of hyperpalatable foods that are highly processed and calorically dense, which obviously can be a very big barrier to you actually improving your body composition if you're not able to stay consistent with your diet and you end up binging or going off the rails a little bit. The second reason is low energy, because you're sleep restricted, is often compensated for by an increase in total caloric consumption. So, a 2004 paper by Spiegel et al. Found that sleep restriction resulted in an 18% reduction in leptin. So again, leptin is the satiety hormone, and a 28% increase in ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. Now, it's not just the consumption of carbohydrate-rich foods. It's actually the combination of fat, salt, and carbohydrates. So generally speaking, no one's going to go and just binge on a bunch of watermelon, or binge on potatoes, or binge on rice. They're binging on things that are very palatable, that are ultra-processed. Things like chips, again, salt, carbohydrates, fat. Fried foods, again, salt, carbohydrates, fat. So there seems to be this combination of ultra-processed foods that are really palatable and super calorically dense that people really seem to be pulled to when they have sleep restriction, because they're trying to make up for the energy deficit that was created by getting insufficient sleep the night before or several nights in the past if this is a chronic thing. Now we can also look at how this actually affects the proportion of fat versus lean mass that you lose when you're in a caloric deficit. This is incredibly important for people who have a body composition goal. So a 2010 paper, and I'm going to butcher this name. I've read this paper a handful of times and I can never frickin' pronounce his name correctly, so I apologize. It's 2010 paper by Nedelcheva and colleagues. Essentially, this paper aimed to determine the impact of sleep deprivation on attempts to reduce adiposity or body fat. Now, what the researchers found was that sleep curtailment decreased the proportion of weight lost as fat by 55%, and it increased the loss of fat-free mass, so lean mass, by 60%. This was accompanied by markers of enhanced neuroendocrine adaptation to caloric restriction, like increased hunger and a shift in relative substrate utilization towards oxidation of less fat. So you're utilizing less body fat, you're burning way less total body fat, and you're actually losing lean mass. So if we have two groups where calories and protein are matched, we're losing weight, and one group is sleep restricted and the other is not, the likelihood that the sleep restricted group is going to lose less fat mass and more lean mass goes up exponentially. These are not small figures. It's not like there's a 5% difference. It's a 55% less fat lost, 60% more lean mass lost. Now, in these particular cohorts, the difference between sleep groups was 8.5 hours and 5.5 hours. Okay, so the regular group had 8.5 hours sleep. The sleep restricted group had 5.5 hours of sleep every night. 5.5 hours of sleep is not super uncommon. I have had lots of clients come to me and their sleep is between 5 and 6.5 hours per night. So this is not uncommon. This is not extreme, especially very busy professionals are going to generally be sleep restricted. And so these are things that affect a lot of people, and it's incredibly important to understand whether or not this is something that's going to impact you and your outcomes. So sleep is critical to making sure that we enhance your body composition, your health, and your performance. There's no other way around it. You have to get sufficient sleep. Now, we can also look at sleep restriction and how it impairs cognition. So sleep restriction can impair cognition from the sense of we have reduced vigilance, we have reduced adherence to diets or other really important protocols, reduced willingness to take on difficult tasks, reduced capacity to solve problems and think clearly and express critical thinking. We see a reduction in your ability to inhibit certain outcomes or certain impulses. So we see a disinhibition, so to speak, especially when it comes to dietary measures like binging or going off diet or anything like that. So these are major problems because if your cognitive faculties are impaired and your physiology is impaired, the likelihood that you're going to make good decisions on a very consistent basis goes down. Now it might go down 10% for some people and 50% for others. The point is that this is very important. It affects your psychology, it affects your emotional state, it affects your physiology in a very, very negative way. Sleep is critical. Now, I want to go over a couple of things that you can actually do and implement today to improve not only the total duration, but the actual quality of your sleep as well. We are going to cover a lot more things in a lot more depth in the later module on sleep, but I wanted to give you guys some takeaways here because this is going to affect your behavior, and this is highly relevant for a lot of the material that we've already covered in this first module on behavior change, as well as the remainder of this module on behavior change. So the first thing is we need to develop a sleep hygiene routine. So what is sleep hygiene in the first place? Well, let's think about oral hygiene. There are a handful of things that you might do to enhance your oral hygiene. We can brush our teeth on a regular basis, we can floss, we can use mouthwash, we can, adjust our diet so we're not eating tons of sugary foods, we can make sure that we're staying hydrated, we can make sure our general health is good and your gut health is good because there is an association between oral health and gut health. We can make sure we're going to the dentist for regular checkups and making sure we have no cavities or anything like that. So there's a lot of different things that you can do from an oral health standpoint that can enhance your hygiene or your oral hygiene. Now, when it comes to sleep, we can adopt very similar practices. Do you have a wind down routine? Or are you just kind of going to bed whenever? Right? It's very important to have a wind down routine because this creates a habituated response to your physiology as well as your psychology. If you're going to bed at 2 a.m. one day and then 8 p.m. the next day, and sometimes you'll be playing video games until you're really exhausted. Other times you'll just kind of be chilling there and you'll be bored and you'll just kind of go to sleep whenever. If we don't have a consistent routine, your body doesn't really know when it's time to wind down. So having a consistent routine is incredibly important for, again, building in that mechanism to your body so it knows that it's going to be going to bed at a particular time. The next thing is going to bed and waking up at specific times. So again, we want to create routine. We want to create habituation. People are creatures of habit. And so if we create a consistent wind down routine and we implement that at the same time every day, we go to bed at the same time, we get up at the same time, that's really important. Now, I understand some people work shifts. I understand some people have variability in their work schedule or other obligations that require them to go to bed and get up at different times. But as effectively as you can, you want to make sure that we are minimizing deviation between the time that you go to bed and the time that you wake up. And that's going to be in an ideal circumstance. So you can manipulate that however you'd like, but just make sure that we are standardizing the bedtime and the wake up time. This is also going to help reinforce a proper biological circadian pattern. So again, we go to bed generally when the sun goes down, we wake up when the sun comes up. So the sun is incredibly important, and not just the sun, but light. So for instance, you want to avoid light later in the evening because that's telling your body that it's time to wake up. It's going to make you feel a little bit more energized and stimulate your sympathetic nervous tone. Whereas we want to actually shift into parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest nervous state. So for instance, The lighting that I have here, this is artificial. The lighting in the back, that's artificial. But we have receptors in our eyes and in our skin that when they are affected by light, it tells us to wake up. So it shifts our nervous system, so to speak. And so because of that, we want to start limiting the exposure to light when it's later in the evening. The artificial light, especially the blue light that is emitted from my laptop or your television or your cell phone, is also going to keep you up. So we want to make sure we're limiting exposure to light. Now that kind of bridges into the next point, which is limit exposure to technology in general. Okay, if we want to wind down, we want to do something that's going to help us feel a little bit more relaxed and at ease. A lot of the times, if you're just on Instagram or YouTube and you're doom scrolling and you're looking at a bunch of political stuff or stuff that's really emotionally or psychologically charged, that's going to amp you up a little bit. It's going to be very difficult to go to bed. So things that you might want to avoid. Okay, well, anything that's going to really be very psychologically or emotionally or physically stimulative. You want to do things that are going to relax you a little bit more, like reading a book or having a hot shower, or maybe going for just like a very light walk kind of around the block or something like that to sort of calm your nerves. But whatever it is that you choose, you want to make sure that it's going to down-regulate your nervous system into more of a relaxed and parasympathetic state. Those are some very basic things that you can do to improve your sleep right off the bat. Okay, make sure you're going to bed and waking up at the same time. Make sure you adopt some sort of a wind down routine. Make sure that you're limiting exposure to light. So getting blackout curtains and making sure that your room is cool. You have earplugs maybe if you're living downtown and it's super loud outside. So you want to start to reduce all sensory perception. And we want to make sure that we do this on a consistent basis. So if you're going to bed, let's say at 2 a.m. and you want to pull your bedtime back to 10 a.m., don't just go to bed at 10 a.m. You're probably going to have to inch yourself there. So maybe instead of going to bed at 2 a.m., you go to bed at 1:30 a.m. and you do that for a couple of days. Then once you adapt, then you go to bed at 12 a.m. and you can, do that for a couple of days, and then just pull it back by let's say 30 minutes. And take a couple of weeks, but eventually you're going to get to going to bed at 10 a.m. and then waking up at whatever time that you'd like. And then you can make that consistent. So one last thing, some people will say, oh, I'm really having a hard time because I just am not tired by the time, my bedtime rolls around. I've been doing the whole 30-minute thing. I've tried all these things. What should I do? Well, just go to bed whenever you go to bed and then set an alarm for really, really early or what time you ideally want to wake up. You're probably going to be pretty damn tired, and that's going to help build up something called sleep pressure. Now, we'll talk a lot more about sleep pressure in a later video, but for now, sleep pressure is exactly how it sounds. It's as you are sleep restricted, there's going to be an increased pressure to actually go back to sleep and get more rest. So if you wake up, let's say you go to bed at 2 a.m. and you wake up at 6 a.m., you're going to be pretty tired for the rest of the day. But by the time 10 p.m. rolls around, you're probably going to be pretty exhausted and you're going to be able to go to bed and kind of reset your cycle, so to speak. So that can be really helpful. If you just get up at the same time, if you get up really early at the target time that you want to get up, that can be a very effective way to increase sleep pressure and force you to go to bed earlier because you generally are fatigued.